line up my slides in pairs in long columns on the light table, and apparently what I did is at some point I put the next line of slides in the wrong box. Anyway, as a result, I'm going to start with the first 4 pairs of slides today to try and get that chronology back in order that I was discussing with you yesterday. Now, what we covered yesterday was really this very earliest formative period of Frank Lloyd Wright, before he went into official architectural practice. In other words, those years between his 19th birthday in 86 to the period in which he had completed a short apprenticeship with the residential shingle-style type architect Silsby, and then gotten a job with Adler and Sullivan, with whom he worked for approximately 6 years, starting out with doing the decorative work for the auditorium building and then doing several residences that were commissioned of Sullivan, but Sullivan didn't wish to design, so he passed them on to his young assistant. And of course, it's very interesting. I mean, here's Wright, only 20, 21 years old. He was Louis Sullivan's primary design assistant during this entire period. Okay, then we mentioned that Wright, to gain extra money, was building these bootleg houses on the quiet without letting Sullivan know about it. Sullivan finally identified one of them as being by Wright, and Wright and Sullivan had this breaking apart, which lasted, unfortunately, for over 20 years. And then Wright went into practice the very year that the World's Columbian exhibition in Chicago ended. That neoclassical exhibition ended in 1893. And the very first commission that Frank Lloyd Wright obtained when he went into work for himself was the Winslow House that we were looking at last time, and beginning with which I screwed up with all my slides. The 1893 William Winslow House here. We looked at the detail of the front door. We looked at the detail of the Sullivan-esque style of Wright's stucco work up here. We looked at the back of the house in terms of how there Wright felt greater freedom to develop ideas that were not as you might almost say neoclassical as the formation that you see on the facade of the building, even though he's not using neoclassical details. And that if you go through the porte cochere to the stables behind, you find this building, which, just like that project that he went to Sullivan with in 1887, which again we'll see today, that he took from Richardson. He seems always able to feel freer when designing something like a barn or stables or whatever it is, rather than a house. And it really takes him from 93 up until the turn of the century, 1900, before he is really able to resolve what he's trying to do in terms of design. Now, some of that we looked at yesterday in a screwed up order. I showed you both these slides yesterday. I mean, this happens to be the Chauncey Williams house in River Forest. It's only about 2 blocks from the Winslow House that we looked at a moment ago. Here, 95 in date, 2 years after the Winslow House. This is 97. This problem Wright is having in trying to deal not only with roof forms, but with the height of a house, keeping this semicircular entrance doorway, which he picked up from Richardson and was to use for years and years, particularly for fireplaces inside a house. And it's really hard to imagine that Wright could spend 7 years groping with this problem. Now here's the typical house of the period. Here's the Heller house that I showed you. Here we're moving up to 97, 98 in date. This is getting closer to the prairie type of house. The only thing Wright has to do is cut down about the lower half of the house and retain the upper part. But you see, he's taking it all from the vernacular. He's learning from the vernacular. It's the same type of forms here. And to look at a vernacular house that Wright looked at frequently, the color slide on this screen is one in River Forest. That Chauncey Williams house I showed you is about half a block down this street, and the Winslow House is only a block or two down this street. In other words, this is a house that Wright went by, heaven knows, dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times, to get to these various commissions that he had in this area. This is an old farmhouse, 1858 in date. Of course, eventually it became suburbia, and the farmhouse got to be part of the suburban complex. But if we compare it with this home in a prairie town that we looked at in the first lecture this week, you can see the relationship, how Wright is integrating these various ideas with the ideas that he already has. We notice immediately that instead of a gable roof, he's using a hip roof. It gets a little quiet, it emphasizes more the horizontal in the design. We have the same relationship of the living room, master bedroom, projecting forward. Then the low roofs here. In this case, of course, it's just a porch roof. Then instead of just having a driveway here, we have a porte-cochere. In other words, he's stretching the house out as far as possible in this project for this very popular ladies' magazine, the Ladies' Home Journal of 1900. Here's the full page that we saw previously. There's the drawing that we just noticed a moment ago. And of course, I repeat, but I've reversed it. The design that Wright made for the stables behind the Cooper House, that which was the design he presented to Louis Sullivan when he applied for a job in 1887. And it's really interesting. In other words, basically from 87 to 1900, before Wright finally developed his fully mature design. Now, another interesting comparison in these two projects for Ladies' Home Journal, whereas this is the one that is closest to the mature prairie house, the plan that we see here is more or less T-shaped. You notice this is the living room with the fireplace. Dining room is at one end, libraries at the other end. This is a type of plan that he used frequently. Then there's the hallway that comes out to the porte-cochere at this point. In 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to show you the Martin House in Buffalo, New York, 1904, 1905. And it is precisely this plan, this T-shaped plan, that Wright was to pick up for the Martin House. And again, notice the way Wright is varying the heights of ceilings according to the use of the spaces therein. If it's a dining room or a library or something, the ceiling is lower than areas in which you would be standing up. Okay, now here's that other Ladies' Home Journal project. Actually, the plan of it is the one that I analyzed in my first lecture, that's so close to the Ross House plan and so close to the Ward Willits plan that we've already seen. The more L shape that you have here, but there you see he's still using the gable roof rather than the hip roof form. But see, already he's not playing around, I should say, concentrating on the use of some organizing system of units. And if you just analyze the plan that we have here, in term, and the red is the analysis of the plan, you can see how there's nothing really arbitrary about this. I mean, look, this is 8 feet, 8 feet, 8 feet, 12 feet, 8 feet, 24 feet. All of this is being very carefully organized. There's no sort of arbitrary, well, this wall happens to be so many feet and the next wall is so many feet. Wright is working out his system of underlying units. And in many of his plans, as we'll see in a moment, he was to actually leave those units in the drawing of the plan. Now, we saw in the very first lecture, this is the Ross House again, where I talked about the way in which Wright was getting rid of the corners. He overlaps the spaces so that, for instance, you have the living room here, like in the Willits house, the dining room there. Part of the space of each room is overlapped into the other so that he is creating more visual space, but a space which is dependent upon the position of the viewer rather than any labeling of a four-walled enclosure. Okay, now if we move to the exterior of the Ward Willits house, this we've seen both previous lectures. This is the drawing of it that appeared in the Wasmuth publication in Berlin in 1910. And here is a relatively recent, I guess I took that photo last year. It's just been nicely restored. One thing that you'll never find in a restored Wright house is the fact that all the woodwork was originally stained. It was never painted. And every time someone restores the Frank Lloyd Wright house, they paint the woodwork, which he never did. He always left materials to express their natural character, and all that exterior woodwork would have been as it came from the sawmill. He never allowed planed lumber to be used. It always had the rough saw marks on it, and as I say, no paint to cover up those marks because he liked to reveal the natural material as it existed in the building. All right, now in the first lecture, I analyzed the central part. We might as well go back and look at it once more. Remember, when you came into the house, you have this choice of going into the reception room. You don't go up the stairs in the living room. It suggests the greater privacy. When you go up those stairs, you recall the slats there that showed you what was existing beyond in the house, but which you could not gain access to immediately. You go up here, and then there's this light flowing through those French doors. You automatically turn towards the light source, which is your left. You come in here in your living room, and of course, eventually, at dinner time, you penetrate into the dining room. Here's a photograph, color photograph of the dining room. It's actually looking from here out towards the point. And the complexity of the plan, you see the axes don't all line up. For instance, the central axis of the dining room doesn't line up with the extended porch on the other side, as we noted in the first lecture, which I showed you. Then 3 years after the Ward Willits house, he got this very important commission from the president of a local mail order house in Buffalo, New York. And this is the Martin House, 1904-1905. This is currently being restored by the state of New York, and it is open to the public. Now, this is interesting. Here you see the unit system going back to the Froebel kindergarten system, and here, where we have it published, the plan is 4 feet 6 inches. So each one of these units is 4 feet 6 inches. He's working out the whole thing in terms of these units. The front of the house is here, as you see it on the forest screen. That photograph is taken at this angle. The main street is at this point. And in this case, you see it's that second plan that we saw in the Ladies' Home Journal. You see this is a dining room, this is a living room, this is the library, fireplace here which is open on both sides. The entrance door is here, staircase is right here. I'm going to show you a photograph of this area in a minute. This is another smaller sitting room with a round arched fireplace, again reminding us of Richardson's work. And then this unfortunately has been destroyed. It was a long alley down to the greenhouse and conservancy here. And then for his sister and her husband, he had this house built on the same estate. Next to, we'll show it to you in color. This is, of course, you can see the porte cochere area. The entrance as you come here, you'll enter in here. This would be the library and the living room on axis in that direction. And you can see the way in which he is treating his brickwork. Even at this stage, notice that the horizontal joints in the brick are raked so that you get a stronger shadow there, and that the vertical joints are not raked. They tend to be smooth. In other words, he's emphasizing the horizontal by the manner in which he rakes the brickwork of all these brick houses. Next, please. And if we go inside that area I was just speaking of, here's the entrance. You see, you come in here. This is the small sitting room or reception room. Again, the round arch that he was so fond of from Richardson. The staircase going up here, and this would lead you to the greenhouse or conservancy at the far end. And again, notice the brickwork, just as I spoke of on the exterior, the raked horizontal joints, the vertical joints, which are usually closer in color or tonality to the brick, so that they won't show up so much, but the horizontal raking of the bricks will be the most prominent thing. Now, one important thing to notice about all of Wright's buildings, I mean, it can be from this very first period of 1900 up to 1957 when he died, that he uses exactly the same materials on the inside of the house as on the outside of the house. Now, of course, this is not typical, certainly not typical of architecture at that period, or indeed even up to today. So if he's using brick primarily on the outside of the house, you'll find it on the inside. If he's treating it with raked horizontal joints, it's going to be raked on the outside of the house and on the inside of the house. He uses the same type of masonry. He usually reduces everything to, he likes to reduce to 3 elements if he can. I mean, if it's a wood house, it will be built of, like the Ward Willett's house that we just saw. It will be stucco. I should have pointed that out on the exterior of the building. It's rough stucco and wood and glass. And if it's a brick house, it may include brick, the wood, and the glass. He won't be introducing a variety of subjects. You may get 4 different materials in a house, but almost never more than that. Next, please. I'm going to now leave domestic architecture briefly and show you 4 of the non-domestic buildings that he was building at exactly the same period. That is to say, from 1902 up to 1907 or 8. And the work that I show you here is one of the additional buildings that he built for his 2 aunts near Spring Green in Wisconsin. Remember, in the very first lecture I showed you the house that he built for their boarding school. And of course, finally, that wasn't large enough, so he built additional buildings. And this was 1902. In other words, this is just the same date as the Ward Willets house that we looked at just a few moments ago. This was to be an open area, basically a gymnasium. The upper part, you can look down on the interior, can also be used as a large gathering room. It has a mammoth fireplace at one end. And then attached to that building, running along here, were the various school rooms and areas for dining and so on. And then back here, additional buildings built behind. Now, it's very interesting because these buildings, of course, his aunts eventually died and the school ceased to exist. And then when Wright founded his Taliesin Fellowship in 1932, of course, here were all these boarding school buildings sitting around not being used. And immediately he started restoring them, and this became the home of the Taliesin Fellowship. What he eventually did is added more buildings. The big drafting room at Taliesin was added to the back part. This major room stayed for its same function. This became the dining hall for the Taliesin Fellowship, which eventually numbered about 60 fellows that were with him during the late 1930s, late 1940s. And then the building at the very end he converted into a theater. He was very fond of music, as I mentioned previously, but also very fond of movies. And he always had every Saturday and Sunday night, there was always one night was devoted to films, the other night was devoted to concerts. And throughout the whole period of the Taliesin Fellowship, those would take place in this part of the building. Well, now, in looking at this building, think about that first lecture again, when we were talking about, or even yesterday's lecture, the Froebel kindergarten blocks. You see the relationship in this building to being able to create it with a series of small blocks of wood. I'll come back to that again with our very next building, which is, next please, the building that he built for Darwin Martin. We've just seen the Martin house, the house that Martin commissioned. He also commissioned the Larkin Building that you see here, Larkin, L-A-R-K-I-N, building in Buffalo. This is one of the few major works by Frank Lloyd Wright that unfortunately has been destroyed. It was destroyed in the 1950s, was no longer being used. It has gone. But basically, it's a mail order house. In other words, a space in which endless secretaries sat and dealt with matters at their desks. This was the main entrance as you come in here. As you can see, there's a fountain at this point going into a pool. Notice even the fountain takes on a horizontal aspect. You go into the lobby area here. The two towers here are for circulation and for toilets and so on. And these towers are also for circulation at the corner. But this emphasis on the block-like forms, and once again you can see the masonry, the horizontal joints of brick being raked, the vertical joints filled in more with masonry so that the horizontality is emphasized and not the verticality. Wright also was very prone to using Roman brick, that is to say the long, narrow brick, because once again, the horizontality of Roman brick was something that he was happy to emphasize. Now, if we go and look once again at, I guess, the same comparison, that I showed you before. I mean, these things that you could build with those Froebel kindergarten blocks, you can almost build Unity Temple that you see here. It's the same idea of putting these block-like forms together with a little bit of ornamentation, as you can see. Richard Bach actually designed the two global figures at the top, but again, there's always a suggestion of some kind of growing natural form, as we will see in future works. Notice the way he's treated the side of the building. Of course, this comes directly out of Louis Sullivan that we were speaking of last time. And the Wainwright Building in St. Louis, the fact of having the emphasis on vertical piers going up between the various windows. And the interior of the building is this great void of space. Oh, I should have mentioned that this was built in the factory area, railroad area, the smoke, the railroad trains, steam trains, and the factories. Very unpleasant area of industrial Buffalo. Therefore, Wright has enclosed the building against the outside and created this large court void with these various floors devoted to secretarial work, storage for files, and then finally up on the top floor is the restaurant, lounge area, and so on for the building. So this is 1904. It's just about the same time, within a matter of months, as the Martin House that we were just looking at. Now, about a year and a half, 2 years after that industrial building, the church that Wright attended in Oak Park, Unity Temple, burned down. And he was given the commission to build a new church on the site. But the problem was, as it always is, was money. It had to be a very inexpensive building. Now, being a Unitarian church, I mean, had it been Church of England or something, one would have perhaps thought of different forms. But Unitarian religion emphasized unity, togetherness, and so on. And this is what Wright programmed in the plan of this church. Notice again here we have the unit system that he's using, 7 feet as the basic unit. And again, going back to the Froebel Kindergarten or the Martin House that we saw a few moments ago, utilizing a unit system to give him the order that he seeks. Now, the main body of the church, you see from the major street on that side, it's the facade here. The 4 facades, or at least 3 of them, are quite similar. You come up here, you enter at this point, and turn left into the church, into the body of the church itself. And this is the part devoted to Sunday school and various social activities. I'm going to show you several details of it. Incidentally, this is a drawing by Marion Mahoney, one of his assistants in his office, very capable draftswoman. In fact, probably it's large. Any of you from Australia? Because she helped her husband design the capital of Australia, Canberra. And of course, Walter Burley Griffin, who was working in Wright's office at this time, won the international competition in 1912 for the design of Canberra. And they moved to Australia at that time. Well, this is one of her renderings at the period. I'm actually going to show you a photograph looking down across this side, looking at that facade across this side, and I'm going to actually show you a detail of this pier to show you what the construction looks like. Here you can clearly see as you come up those steps, you come into the entry, here are the different Sunday school rooms and so forth. You come in here, and unlike most churches, you come in from the side of the altar. Here's the altar, although it's not really an altar in a Unitarian church. You come in here, and the pulpit is a better word for me to use. The pulpit is here. You pass around here, you get your seating here, and you see the corners are used for vertical circulation, just as we saw in the Larkin Building a few moments ago. Okay, let's look at the next two views. Here are a couple of my photographs of it. Here's the Main Street facade. You see looking down the side street. Here's that staircase, the Sunday school area here, and you would turn at that point. Here are the corner stair towers that I just pointed out in the plan. And if we look at this bit of masonry right here, here's a close-up photograph I made of that, just to give you an idea what it is. You see, Wright has used, in creating this concrete, he has used these small pebbles, and then once the material, the concrete was poured and the forms were removed, they scrubbed with brushes, heavy brushes, I mean scrub brushes. They scrubbed the surface to get the cement off the surface and to reveal the aggregate that was used in the forms. Actually, that has posed a certain problem. As you can see in almost any photograph you see of the finished of the building today, each time it gets restored or something, the different pores tend to show. I like this photograph of mine because virtually all my other photographs show you where each day's pore stopped, and that has been a problem in restoring. Anyway, notice there are only the very high windows. There are windows in the ceiling, flat ceiling, we'll see in just a moment. And on the exterior, see here you can see the different pores that I was mentioning before that proved a certain problem. But again, notice the way he's utilizing certain natural forms. I don't know what this form is. It certainly reminds me of the hollyhock that he was to use in 1920 when you get to Los Angeles, and it certainly is the predecessor for the hollyhock. But anyway, here's his drawing for the these pilasters, and here as it actually exists. And then if we go inside the building, next please, you see those windows are very, very high up. There you can see one of the pilasters through the windows, and this is looking back toward the pulpit, and you see the circulation would come in here. You were coming into the lower area. In here, you come in at this level. If you're coming around the back way, it's rather interesting. You're at a half level below. These are all worked out at half levels. So the circulation, if you want to go to the back, is lower than the floor level here. Now, one of the things I want to point out here, and I think it's very important, Wright, we've talked about getting rid of corners. Now, we all know the way any, I don't care, Renaissance or 18th century or whatever, look at the paneling of a wall. You always get a rectangular treatment. Notice the way that Wright treats corners. You don't have a rectangular treatment on this wall and then a rectangular treatment on this wall, but he takes his defining element for that, be it plaster or wood or whatever, and you see he goes right around the corner so that the decoration, if you want to use that word for it, of these strips of wood define a three-dimensional space, not a two-dimensional space. They define the space here and the space on this side of that pier. You notice that is consistently carried out throughout the interior. So he's thinking in terms of three-dimensional definition of space in the way he treats this interior. This area is where the organ is. The organ is located behind that screen, and here you can just barely see one of the most popular things that gets cribbed from Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture is the ceiling. You see hundreds of them around the Western world these days. These square holes that go up and allow the light to flow directly down on the congregation. They've become very popular at entrance halls and big commercial offices. And notice every element within the design is, of course, carefully designed by Wright. The light fixtures, again, notice the emphasis on geometry, whether it be a square or a circle. All of these elements from pure geometry that he incorporates in his design. Okay, and so that was 1906. By 1909, he's designing works in Mason City. I don't have the time to show you, of course, all of his work. I'm just picking a few examples. This is a hotel. It's actually a hotel in the bank. There's a bank building beside it that he designed, and this hotel. What's the building on the other screen? What? Yes, yes, Walter Gropius's building in 1914 at Cologne for the exhibition. And I guess I told the story already, so I won't repeat it. I mentioned it in the first lecture, how Gropius insisted to me that he'd never been influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. Of course, he had drawings and photographs of this building right in his office 50 years after after this building was designed by Wright. And I think there can be no question that that and many other things that appear in Europe were inspired by the publications in 1910 and 1911 of Wright's work. I mean, this was published as a drawing in the big Bosworth folio, and then the year after that it was published as a photograph in the smaller, less expensive Bosworth folio. Yeah, like Corbeau. I remember talking to Corbeau, I forget at one point, it was one time when he met Wright, so this would have been in the 50s or something. He said, oh yes, it'd be interesting to meet Mr. Wright. He didn't know a thing about his architecture, but he was rather hesitant to have this dinner party in Paris with Wright, and insisted that he knew nothing about Wright's work up to that point. I did happen to know Emery. Emery was Gropius's earliest apprentice, started working for, Le Corbusier's earliest apprentice started working for Corbeau in 1923, and he has told me that the photograph book of Wright's work, published by Bosworth in 1911, was in Corbeau's office in 1923 when he first went to work there. I mean, all these people who knew nothing about Frank Lloyd Wright, they just, of course, had all his books all around them. Okay, so now we go back to domestic architecture again. We got up to 1907, 1908. We, in the first lecture, spoke about this project, fireproof house for $5,000, which I mentioned was Wright's attempt to take a different type of vernacular building of the American architectural scene, particularly prevalent in Midwest, but certainly prevalent from coast to coast in the United States. These 4 square houses that you see by the tens of thousands in America today, and how Wright tried to bring greater sophistication not only to the design of the exterior, but particularly the interior plan that we mentioned in terms of the way in which he had these long windows going along the side, so that when you sat in the living room or the dining room, you didn't have a feeling that you were enclosed in a box, but that the space went on indefinitely. You couldn't tell where the end of that space was. And then we saw how 2 years later he was to develop this idea in terms of the Roby House. Next, please. In Chicago. Here's that plan again, and I showed it to you in the first lecture where we spoke of the French doors along the side of the Roby House, and how in the same way those French doors pick up this theme that he already explored a couple of years earlier in this project to extend the space of the living room down here so that you can't tell where the living room ends and where the dining room really begins. We also mentioned the very different way in which he treated the center of the room, long, narrow room, forced to be long and narrow because of the plot of land here in the city, and the ceiling, like the walls, you see, carries that horizontality right through the fireplace at this point. And then, oh, I should have pointed out, could you go back? Yeah. I should have pointed out, and I showed you in the lecture on Tuesday, looking out these windows, the privacy, next please, the privacy that you get when you look out these windows. You just look out at lawn on the other side of the street, and here's what actually is between you when you're standing in this house looking out and the lawn over here. What exists between the lawn and you is this double row of cars, 2 sidewalks, all the traffic and all the rest. But Wright has managed to give you this wonderful degree of privacy on the interior of the house. Okay, here's another view of the living room looking in the opposite direction, looking towards this prow of the room, and the whole business of the long horizontal space being divided by the fireplace, but being given this greater unity by the continuous band of illumination, in this case French doors, that are going down this side of the room. Next, please. That house again. And at this point, I mean, the house is often described as Wright's answer to Cubism. Of course, this is exactly the same moment that Picasso was creating Cubism. And when you look at detailed photographs like this, there are certainly cubistic aspects to it. I don't mean to suggest any influence one way or the other here. And here you can see a very poor job of repair. I won't even call it restoration. You see masons have gone and simply filled in those horizontal joints, the vertical joints, and these are Roman bricks, not typical common brick, but they're the long, narrow Roman brick. See, these verticals should be a mortar which is tinted to resemble the bricks, and of course the horizontal elements should be deeply in size. That's just the problem. Of course, it's cheaper to redo a house in that way. But when we get to this building, the Roby House, 1907, 1908, it was just being finished in 1909, at which time Wright left the United States and went to Europe with his lover, who was a client's wife. And so his career takes a profound break in the autumn, in September, October of 1909. And this period after 1909, after he returns home, he's socially rejected in Oak Park. He has to leave there. He finally goes to his childhood home area up near Spring Green, Wisconsin, and starts the year after he gets back, 1911, he starts to build a new home for himself, Taliesin, and we will spend a good deal of time looking at Taliesin. But as this is his really last completed work, well, it wasn't completed when he left, along with other buildings, notice the emphasis on horizontality, how you're almost beginning to feel that the roof is becoming flat. It's getting closer and closer to being a slab. And even in the detail and color on the opposite screen, I think you get a bit of that color, that flavor. And notice the way the porch roof, the cantilevered element, becomes very important throughout the design. You get another cantilevered roof coming way out off the dining room on the other side. And these are elements that he picks up not only in something like the Roby House, but we can see it in other projects that he never executed. This was for Bach, a project that never got built, but this is 1906, 1907 in date, so you see already before 1909, 1910, he's thinking in terms of a residential building with a flat slab roof, and even in non-residential work, this is a boathouse that he designed for Madison, Wisconsin, and the boathouse, of course, here has this flat slab roof. So we already find him working towards the flat-roofed buildings. The cantilevered form is becoming increasingly important in his designs. And in 1907, 1908, in other words, just the date of the two projects that I just showed you, he built this house for Thomas Gale. I actually showed you an earlier house by Thomas Gale that had been built in the bootleg period, and Gale wanted a bigger house, and this is down the same street as Frank Lloyd Wright's own house, the Thomas Gale house, 1907, 1908. And I think Wright always made the point that it was the Thomas Gale house that was his inspiration for designing Falling Water in 1936. So you get these long spans of time. Of course, Wright lived long enough. He lived into his 92nd year so that he could always pick up these elements from many, many years earlier in his career and develop the forms in his architecture. So it's at this point that I will pick up the theme in, let's see, it's Monday's lecture, right? Monday at 5 o'clock. I'll pick it up after he returns from Europe. What was he doing in Europe? He was doing the drawings for Vosmuth. That's why he chose to go to Europe when he was suddenly in disgrace for having eloped with this married woman. And they both went to Berlin to talk with Ernst Vosmuth about the publication. Then they settled in Fiesole, just outside of Florence, in Italy, where he worked with one of his sons and another draftsman to produce all those drawings for the big folio of drawings. And then he, as I say, when he came back to America, he was no longer welcome in the Oak Park, Chicago area, and he basically moved to the old Homestead area in Wisconsin and began to build Taliesin, which was his new home. And we'll pick up with that subject on the lecture on Monday. Thank you very much. I understand they have to clear out this room for drinks. Well, not for me, but.
Would like to ask a question?
Oh yeah, any questions? Sure.
What about
About what?
Wright's politics.
Um,
Where do you stand in the left-right Republican Democrat?
Well, he was always strongly anti-war, and this got him in a certain amount of trouble, both in the First World War and the Second World War. His fellows, he instructed them not to show up for military service, and many of them ended up in jail, and so on. Otherwise, he was very fond of Wisconsin politics as they stood. I can't think of the name of the guy who became governor. What?
Socialists. They were socialists.
Yes, yes, yes. Oh, certainly he was more socialist, yeah. And the whole emphasis on the common people and so forth, yes. Any other question? Yes.
The question of how much of an effect do you think the fact that Wright was a Unitarian had on his sort of way of developing forms?
You know, that's a question I would like to know more about. I've always meant to study the Unitarian religion and to ask people who are immersed in it what the relationship could be. I find it interesting that there's, to my knowledge, has never been a publication that deals with this question of Unitarianism and Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. I mean, I think it's one of those fascinating, so far unanswered questions.
Because it's striking how much his Unity Temple, you can see that evolved right into Kahn's Unitarian Temple in Rochester. I mean, if you look at the formally, they're very similar. And it's interesting, and of course Kahn wasn't a Unitarian, but I'm curious as to what degree that development of the formal sort of language of Unitarianism becomes sort of one of Wright's legacies. At least it does, right?
Yes, very good point. There's a PhD project for you.
What was the relationship between...
I can't see you. Where are you?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Frank Lloyd Wright very much criticized me and Rowe for the Farnsworth House. So what does that tell about the relationship?
For the which house?
Farnsworth.
Farnsworth, okay.
What did that tell about the relationship between Frank Lloyd Wright and the Bauhaus?
He may have criticized Mies for the Farnsworth House, which happens to be going up for auction for sale this month, if you want to bid. However, he liked Mies very, very much. I mean, he was they were very close friends. Mies frequently went to Taliesin, and Mies was one of Wright's great supporters. He did in that book I did, Writings on Wright, I republished the article Mies wrote about 1910 and the impact that Wright's work had in Berlin at that period of time. Yeah, I mean, Mies was the exception to the rule. What am I trying to say? Oh yeah, when Wright finally was given the gold medal by the AIA in the United States, Mies got up and made a really wonderful talk in German on the debt that he and others owed to Frank Lloyd Wright. And then at the AIA meeting, when it was translated after Mies sat down, they left out every part of Mies's talk that complimented Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, typical American attitude. No, I mean, Wright was always disliked as an architect, and still is today. I mean, what influence is he having? Well, I'll be talking about that a bit in a future lecture, but it's the wrong kind of influence. Yes, any other questions? Yes.
I talk about influence on a question. I'm interested in how his work filtered into American mainstream architecture. You know, you talked about sort of four epochs. You know,
That I talked about what?
You talked about these, you know, the hundreds of thousands of houses which he saw and tried to improve. And can you sort of pinpoint
Yes, they did filter into American architecture, but ill understood. And I've got four pairs of slides, I think, and I don't remember, it's Monday's lecture. I guess it's probably Monday's lecture. Yes, it's Monday's lecture, showing how the Prairie House, which we were talking about today, filtered into American architecture. Now, initially, they debated whether to include some of Wright's contemporaries in their work in these lectures. But at this whole period, I mean, there was these people working in his office, like Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Manning, who I mentioned went on to Australia to design the capital of Australia. These people developed a very active architectural practice, and that I'll mention on Monday. And they were especially active in the period after 1910. In other words, when Wright left, they all had to leave his office, and they went out and practiced on their own. Then the American West, and Chicago at that time was called the West. We call it the Midwest today, but Illinois and so on was considered the West. The West did not accept Eastern ideas, i.e. New England ideas, Virginia ideas, and so on, in terms of architecture, until World War I. And World War I completely changed attitudes towards architecture. And the Midwest became converted to Eastern ideas. And you'll find, I mean, where does Wright go to find work after he builds Taliesin? You know, where? Yeah, California. You see, he has to go further west to find clients who are willing to accept his work, because they aren't accepting his work in the greater Chicago area. And this happened to all of Wright's former apprentices. They had two choices. One was to go further west, as William Purcell did, for example, or Barry Byrne did, or you stayed in the Chicago area and built neoclassical houses, or Tudor Gothic houses, and I'm going to show you some of them that these men did. I mean, what they did before World War I and what they did after World War I. If they wanted to earn a living, they had to go Tudor Gothic or neoclassical. Yeah, I think they need this room for whatever.